If you've followed me for the past number of years, you'll know that I'm often critical of the media, Democrats, and others consistently overhyping every single thing that Trump does, using incessantly hyperbolic language to depict even relatively trivial utterances or to cast all his actions in these kinds of unhelpfully apocalyptic terms. I think that has created an environment politically that's prone to hysteria, prone to paranoia, and also prone to poor analysis. And paranoid and poor analysis was a sizable contributing factor to the catastrophic failure to accurately cover the entire Russia investigation and its aftermath. And every single day or every other week or at a large pace, let's put it that way, there was always something coming out about the Russia investigation that would inevitably be cast in these kinds of world historic terms, and it turned out to be a total joke. That all aside, there is a way in which taking that attitude toward Trump and the way Trump is covered more generally gives one something of credibility to actually opine when he does things that do genuinely raise concerns or even are worthy of fervent denunciation, because I'm not running around every single day denouncing every single thing that he does, even when those things are trivial or when they've been misconstrued by the media or when it's just a cheap partisan talking point. That's not my posture. So when I look at the way that he's approached the squad, which is such a silly and juvenile term, anyway, I can, on the one hand, see that much of the time the way that issues are framed by, for example, AOC, where she insinuated that Nancy Pelosi was a racist and singling her and her colleagues out on the basis of race, that I think is not particularly constructive discourse, let's say. And also, people don't really believe that Nancy Pelosi is a racist. The only people who believe that are probably a handful of very loud and active people on Twitter. So I can acknowledge the way in which AOC in particular tends to be prone to bringing about inflammatory rhetoric that isn't even inflammatory for any real justifiable purpose. It's just kind of inflammatory for its own sake. And yet, you have to acknowledge that the way Trump has inflamed the situation around Omar is not just worrisome, but potentially dangerous. I don't want to say dangerous in the sense that anybody is going to necessarily act physically on the frenzy that has been stoked, but dangerous more about just the way that it degrades social cohesion. And let me give another qualifier up front. I think there are potentially fair criticisms one might raise about Omar. For example, you'll often find that when she's asked to address pushback or various complaints that people have with her, she tends to lapse into identity-based defenses, which is to say that she doesn't proffer a coherent argument as to why those criticisms are misguided. She'll often invoke her identity status. And maybe her identity status is relevant a lot of the time, but in a open, pluralistic society, you want to at least strive to advance a argument that is amenable to rational inquiry rather than just using your inborn characteristics as a response to whatever political criticism you're receiving. So that's a legitimate argument. She hasn't done that all the time, but there are instances. Another legitimate, potentially, argument against her is that she has withheld certain documents that would shine light on aspects of her past, namely this issue about a marriage that she undertook in the late 2000s. Now, is some of the intrigue and some of the suspicion around that marriage probably rooted in an irrational disdain toward her on the basis of her inborn personal characteristics? Yes. But that's not a valid justification for withholding documents when they're requested by legitimate news organizations, as the Star Tribune in Minnesota has done. They've asked her to provide immigration and tax records that would bring closure to this question of what purpose her second marriage served. Obviously, that's been an object of fascination for right-wing websites and blogs and social media personalities. And the Star Tribune, as the local newspaper, has attempted to do a dispassionate investigation of whether those claims against her have merit. And so they asked her to provide documentation on that marriage, and she declined to do so. So I'm not saying that every immigrant or every refugee has some kind of inherent obligation to prove that their status in the country is legitimate, but when you're running for public office and when you're now a member of Congress, the transparency obligations on you obviously increase. So if you're really that wound up about the marriage issue, yes, I think it can at least be conceded that she has been less than forthcoming with the relevant documentation. However, that was all one big lead up to what I'm about to say now, which is that the blithering fury at her, which is coming largely from the right now, but not exclusively. You have Democrats and liberals who maybe less vocally complain about her, but nevertheless still have criticisms. But, you know, the beating heart of it right now is on the right, and Trump amped that up to a much higher degree last night at his rally in North Carolina. The blithering, unhinged fury against her is almost entirely rooted, I would contend, in irrational animus. And it's notable that when you ask people why they dislike Omar so much, they really can't put forth a coherent argument. They have identity-based objections to her. They take some kind of intrinsic offense to the notion that she, as somebody who was born in Somalia and came to the United States as a refugee, could then level criticisms about how the United States government is run, which is entirely within her rights as a U.S. citizen, just like any other citizen. She was democratically elected, both to the Minnesota state legislature and now to the U.S. Congress. So part of her very job description is to opine on how she thinks the government should be run. If you don't like it, you have the opportunity every 2 years to vote her out of office. That's how it works. But this idea that you're going to have such umbrage and such an emotional disdain toward her simply by virtue of her making criticisms of U.S. government policy, you're engaging in the very kind of identity-based politics that you would probably claim to loathe in most other circumstances. Is she subject to legitimate criticisms that are based on facts and reasoning and policy disputes? Yes, of course. She's a member of Congress. That should go without saying. But to use, again, her inborn personal characteristics as the crux of your criticism is engaging in a form of identity politics that maybe you're not cognizant of if this is your disposition toward her, but is perfectly obvious to anybody who can actually look at it dispassionately. And notice, I went through and conceded potentially legitimate criticisms you might raise about her. I still think the focus on the marriage issue is a little disproportionate, and it's not as glaring as some people would make it out to be. But nonetheless, she's a member of Congress, so therefore, yes, she's subject to high transparency requirements. But it seems as though people loathe her for reasons that they can barely articulate. They say that she hates America. Okay, what's the evidence for that? You don't really get any. When you actually drill down into the evidence for her being supposedly anti-America, she at times has made remarks that aren't the most articulate in the world, such as when she said the people who committed the 9/11 attacks were people who did some things, which is just like, the point that she was making was valid in the sense that she was saying that because certain extremist Muslims committed the 9/11 attacks, those people were being used as a justification to deprive others of civil liberties. Could it have been more articulate? Sure. But did it indicate a genuine belief that somehow Al-Qaeda or the 9/11 terrorists were favorable, that her views toward them were favorable? No. I mean, only if you willfully misconstrue the words to fit whatever your predetermined agenda is, which is, of course, what many people have done. And then the other idea that she hates Israel or that she's anti-Semitic, we went through this months ago. Look at the words that she uttered. None of it suggested anything in particular to do with an animus toward Jews. She was talking about the Israel lobby in the United States, which is, in fact, very powerful. It was funny because when that whole controversy broke out in February, a few days later, the Wall Street Journal put out a news article highlighting that, yes, AIPAC and the broader Israel lobby does have unique financial resources to exert influence upon the U.S. government and shape policy in a direction that is favorable to their interests, just like every other lobbying group. So unless you're saying that the Wall Street Journal reporters who published that article are somehow also anti-Semitic, you haven't found a specific instance where she expressed irrational animus towards Jews, which is the core of anti-Semitism. And it's funny as well that so-called nationalists who are on board with the America First agenda and therefore cheer Trump's comments stoking antipathy toward Omar, they claim that they're all in favor of this because it's a furtherance of this nationalistic agenda that they're so committed to. And yet, when Trump gives his motivation for why he's focused on Omar, he'll often cite Israel rather than America. So he's stoking this so supposedly nationalistic fervor on behalf of a foreign country. And I'd like to know what conception that is coherent of nationalism that figures into, because it's a little mysterious. So she hasn't expressed hatred for America. She's actually expressed fondness for America in quotes that don't get nearly as much of attention, and appreciation for America. But she, just like every other U.S. citizen, couples that with policy critiques, which you can agree or disagree with, but nobody of other standing is typically decried as an America hater simply because they're leveling criticisms of the country in which they are a citizen. So the three key points here are number one, she is not anti-Semitic by any evidence that is currently available. The main quotes provided to establish that she is supposedly anti-Semitic have been totally twisted and distorted for the purpose of delegitimizing her and making her anathema, and they've been actually somewhat successful in doing that. So that's number one. Number two, she didn't express any kinship or sympathy for Al-Qaeda. That is a result of a ridiculously bad faith misinterpretation of a fleeting quote that she gave from a few months ago. And number three, she hasn't expressed hatred of America unless you believe that having a vociferous policy critique about foreign policy, domestic policy, what have you, is somehow tantamount to hating America. I've made many of the same foreign policy critiques that she has, and yet I don't hate America, and I wouldn't have to justify or prove that I don't hate America. And if you think that she has a unique obligation to make that justification, then maybe you are motivated by this kind of vengeful paranoia that maybe warrants a little bit of self-examination on your part. The kind of disproportionate fury that she engenders, I think, is proof that a lot of what's animating it is just kind of this kind of knee-jerk, highly emotional, irrational antipathy that doesn't lend itself to any kind of fruitful dialogue and ought to be challenged. So that's what I'm doing right now. And I will leave it there. Subscribe to this channel. Or don't. See you later.